Dove Audio presents Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. My father had a small estate in Nottinghamshire. I was the third of 5 sons. He sent me to Emmanuel College in Cambridge at 14 years old, where I resided 3 years and applied myself close to my studies. But the charge of maintaining me being too great for the narrow fortune, I was bound apprentice to Mr. James Bates, an eminent surgeon in London, with whom I continued 4 years, and my father now and then sending me small sums of money, I laid them out in learning navigation and other parts of the mathematics, useful to those who intend to travel. When I left Mr. Bates, I went down to my father, where, by the assistance of him and my Uncle John, I got £40, a promise of £30 a year to maintain me at Leyden. There I studied physic 2 years and 7 months, knowing it would be useful to me in long voyages. Soon after my return from Leyden, I was recommended by my good master, Mr. Bates, to be surgeon to the Swallow, Captain Abraham Pennell, commander, with whom I continued 3 years and a half, making a voyage or two into the Levant and some other parts. When I came back, I resolved to settle in London, to which Mr. Bates encouraged me, and by him I was recommended to several patients. I took part of a small house in the Old Jewry, and being advised to alter my condition, I married Miss Mary Burton, with whom I received £400 for a portion. But my good master Bates dying 2 years after, and I having few friends, my business began to fail. Having therefore consulted with my wife, I determined to go again to sea. I was surgeon successively on 2 ships, and made several voyages, for 6 years to the East and West Indies, by which I got some addition to my fortune. The last of these voyages not proving very fortunate, I grew weary of the sea, and intended to stay at home with my wife and family. I removed from the Old Jewry to Fetter Lane, and from then to Wapping, hoping to get business among the sailors. But it would not turn to account. After 3 years' expectation that things would mend, I accepted an offer from Captain William Pritchard, master of the Antelope, who was making a voyage to the South Sea. We set sail from Bristol May 4, 1699, and our voyage at first was very prosperous. In our passage from thence to the East Indies, we were driven by a violent storm to the northwest of Van Diemen's Land. 12 of our crew were dead by immoderate labor and ill food. The rest were in a very weak condition. On the 5th of November, the weather being very hazy, the seamen spied a rock within a half-cable's length of the ship, but the wind was so strong that we were driven directly upon it and immediately split. 6 of the crew, of whom I was one, having let down the boat into the sea, made a shift to get clear of the ship and the rock. We rowed about 3 leagues till we were able to work no longer. We therefore trusted ourselves to the mercy of the waves, and in about half an hour the boat was overset by a sudden flurry from the north. What became of my companions in the boat, as well as those who escaped on the rock or were left in the vessel, I cannot tell, but conclude they were all lost. For my own part, I swam as fortune directed me, and was pushed forward by wind and tide. I often let my legs drop and could feel no bottom, but when I was almost gone and able to struggle no longer, I found myself within my depth. The declivity was so small that I walked near a mile before I got to the shore. I then advanced toward near half a mile, but could not discover any sign of houses or inhabitants. I was extremely tired, and with that, and the heat of the weather, and about a half a pint of brandy that I drank as I left the ship, I found myself much inclined to sleep. I lay down on the grass, which was very short and soft, where I slept sounder than I ever remembered to have done in my life, and, as I reckoned, about 9 hours, for when I awakened, it was just daylight. I attempted to rise, but was not able to stir. As I happened to lie on my back, I found my arms and legs were strongly fastened on each side to the ground, and my hair, which was long and thick, tied down in the same manner. I likewise felt several slender ligatures across my body, from my armpits to my thighs. I could only look upwards. I heard a confused noise about me, but in the posture I lay, could see nothing except the sky. In a little time I felt something alive, moving on my left leg, which, advancing gently forward over my breast, came almost up to my chin. When, bending my eyes downward as much as I could, I perceived it to be a human creature not 6 inches high, with a bow and arrow in his hands, and a quiver at his back. In the meantime, I felt at least 40 more of the same kind following the first. I was in the utmost astonishment, and roared so loud that they all ran back in affright. However, they soon returned, and one of them, who ventured so far as to get a full sight of my face, cried out in a shrill but distinct voice, "Hecina de Gull!" The others repeated the same word several times, but I then knew not what they meant. I lay all this while in great uneasiness, struggling to get loose. I had the fortune to break the strings and wrench out the pegs that fastened my left arm to the ground, for, by lifting it up to my face, I discovered the methods they had taken to bind me. And at the same time, with a violent pull, I loosened the strings that tied down my hair on the left side, so that I was able to turn my head about 2 inches. But the creatures ran off a second time before I could seize them, whereupon there was a great shout in a shrill accent, and after it had ceased, I heard one of them cry aloud, "Tolgo Phonak!" when, in an instant, I felt above 100 arrows discharged on my left hand, which pricked me like so many needles, and besides, they shot another flight into the air, as we do bombs in Europe, whereof many, I suppose, fell on my body, though I felt them not, and some on my face, which I immediately covered with my left hand. When this shower of arrows was over, I fell, with grief and pain, and then, striving to get loose, they discharged another volley, larger than the first, and some of them attempted with spears to stick me in the sides. But by good luck I had on me a buff jerkin, which they could not pierce. I thought it the most prudent method to lie still, and my design was to continue so till night, when I could easily free myself, and as for the inhabitants, I had reason to believe I might be a match for the greatest army they could bring against me, if they all were of the same size with him that I saw. But fortune disposed otherwise of me. When the people observed I was quiet, they discharged no more arrows, but by the noise I heard, I knew their numbers increased. I heard a knocking for above an hour, like that of people at work, when, turning my head as well as the pegs and strings would permit me, I saw a stage erected about 1.5 feet from the ground, capable of holding 4 of the inhabitants, with 2 ladders to mount it, from whence one of them made me a long speech, whereof I understood not 1 syllable. Before the principal person began his oration, he cried out 3 times, "Langro de Hul San," whereupon immediately about 50 of the inhabitants came and cut the string that fastened the left side of my head, which gave the liberty of turning it to the right and of observing the person that was to speak. He appeared to be of middle age and taller than any of the other who attended him. He acted every part of an orator, and I could observe many periods of threatenings and others of promises, pity, and kindness. I answered in a few words, but in the most submissive manner, lifting up my left hand and both my eyes to the sun, as calling him for a witness, and being almost famished with hunger, not having eaten a morsel for some hours before I left the ship, I found the demands of nature so strong upon me that I could not forbear showing my impatience by putting my finger frequently to my mouth to signify that I wanted food. The Hergo, for so they called a great lord, as I afterwards learnt, understood me very well. He descended from the stage, and commanded that several ladders should be applied to my sides, on which above 100 inhabitants mounted, and walked towards my mouth, laden with baskets full of meat, which had been provided and sent thither by the king's orders, upon the first intelligence he received of me. I observed there was the flesh of several animals, but could not distinguish them by taste. There were shoulders, legs, and loins, shaped like those of mutton, but smaller than the wings of a lark. They supplied me as fast as they could, showing 1,000 marks of wonder and astonishment at my bulk and appetite. I then made another sign that I wanted drink. They found by my eating that a small quantity would not suffice me, and being a most ingenious people, they slung up one of their largest hogsheads, then rolled it towards my hand, and beat out the top. I drank it off at a draught, for it did not hold half a pint, and tasted like a wine of Burgundy, but much more delicious. They brought me a second hogshead, which I drank in the same manner, and made signs for more, but they had none to give me. When I had performed these wonders, they shouted for joy, and danced upon my breast, repeating several times, Hecina de Gull. They made me a sign that I should throw down the 2 hogsheads, but first warning the people below to stand out of the way, crying aloud, Borach Mavola! I now considered myself bound by the laws of hospitality to a people who had treated me with much expense and magnificence. However, in my thoughts I could not sufficiently wonder at the intrepidity of these diminutive mortals who durst venture to mount and walk upon my body, while one of my hands was at liberty, without trembling at the very sight of so prodigious a creature as I must appear to them. After some time, when they observed that I made no more demands for meat, there appeared before me a person of high rank, from His Imperial Majesty. His Excellency, having mounted on the small of my right leg, advanced forwards up to my face with about a dozen of his retinue, and producing his credentials under the signet royal, which he applied close to my eyes, spoke about 10 minutes, often pointing forwards, which, as I afterwards found, was towards the capital city, about half a mile distant, whither it was agreed by His Majesty in council that I must be conveyed. I answered in few words, but to no purpose, and made a sign with my hand that was loose, putting it to the other and then to my own head and body, to signify that I desired my liberty. It appeared that he understood me well enough, for he shook his head by way of disapprobation, and held his hands in a posture to show that I must be carried as a prisoner. Whereupon I once more thought of attempting to break my bonds. But again, when I felt the smart of their arrows upon my face and hands, and observing that the number of my enemies increased, I gave tokens to let them know that they might do with me what they pleased. Upon this, the Hergo and his train withdrew with much civility and cheerful countenances. Soon after I heard a general shout, with frequent repetitions of the words, Peplam Selan, and I felt great numbers of people on my left side, relaxing the cords to such a degree that I was able to turn upon my right and to ease myself with making water, which I very plentifully did, to the great astonishment of the people. But before this they had daubed my face and both my hands with a sort of ointment which removed all the smart of their arrows. These circumstances, added to the refreshment I had received by their victuals and drink, disposed me to sleep. I slept about 10 hours, and it is no wonder, for the physicians by the emperor's order had mingled a sleepy potion in the wine. These people are most excellent mathematicians, and arrived to a great perfection in mechanics by the encouragement of the emperor. This prince has several machines fixed on wheels for the carriage of trees and other great weights. He often builds his largest men of war in the woods where the timber grows, and has them carried on these engines 300 or 400 yards to the sea. 500 carpenters and engineers were immediately set at work to prepare the greatest engine they had. It was a frame of wood, raised 3 inches from the ground, about 7 feet long and 4 wide, moving upon 22 wheels. It was brought parallel to me as I lay. The principal difficulty was to raise and place me in this vehicle. 80 poles, each of 1 foot high, were erected for this purpose, and very strong cords were fastened by hooks to many bandages which the workmen had girt round my neck, hands, body, and legs. 900 of the strongest men were employed to draw up these cords by many pulleys fastened on the poles, and in less than 3 hours I was raised and slung into the engine and there tied fast. All this I was told, for while the operation was performing, I lay in a profound sleep by the force of that medicine infused into my liquor. 1,500 of the emperor's largest horses, each about 4 inches and a half high, were employed to draw me towards the metropolis, which was half a mile distant. We made a long march the remaining part of the day, and rested at night with 500 guards on each side of me, half with torches and half with bows and arrows, ready to shoot me if I should stir. The next morning at sunrise we continued our march, and arrived within 200 yards of the city gates about noon. The emperor and all of his court came out to meet us, but his great officers would by no means suffer his majesty to endanger his person by mounting on my body. At the place where the carriage stopped, there stood an ancient temple, esteemed to be the largest in the whole kingdom, which, having been polluted some years before by an unnatural murder, was looked upon as profane, and all ornaments and furniture carried away. In this edifice it was determined I should lodge. The great gate fronting to the north was about 4 feet high, and almost 2 feet wide, through which I could easily creep. On each side of the gate was a small window, not above 6 inches from the ground. Into that on the left side the king's smith conveyed 411 chains, which were locked to my left with 36 padlocks. Over against this temple there was a turret, at least 5 feet high. Here the emperor ascended, with many principal lords of his court, to have an opportunity of viewing me, as I was told, for I could not see them. It was reckoned that above 100,000 inhabitants came out of the town upon the same errand, and in spite of my guards, I believe there could not be fewer than 10,000 at several times who mounted my body by the help of ladders. But a proclamation was soon issued to forbid it upon pain of death. When the workmen found it was impossible for me to break loose, they cut all the strings that bound me, whereupon I rose up with as melancholy a disposition as ever I had in my life. But the noise and astonishment of the people at seeing me rise and walk are not to be expressed. The chains that held my left leg were about 2 yards long, and gave me not only the liberty of walking backwards and forwards in a semicircle, but, being fixed within 4 inches of the gate, allowed me to creep in and lie at my full length in the temple. Quietly as I had endured my confinement to one posture, it was with great pleasure that I found myself again on my feet. I looked about me. The country around appeared like a continued garden, and the enclosed fields, which were generally 40 feet square, resembled so many beds of flowers. I viewed the town on my left hand, which looked like the painted scene of a city in a theater. I had been for some hours extremely tired, however, so I crept back into my house and shut the door after me. But it was of no use to try and get rid of so much company. I had to come out again. I soon found that the emperor had descended from the tower and was advancing on horseback towards me. The beast, though very well trained, yet unused to such a sight, which appeared as if a mountain moved before him, reared upon its hind feet. But the prince kept his seat till his attendants ran in, and held the bridle while his majesty had time to dismount. When he alighted, he surveyed me round with great admiration, but kept beyond the length of my chain. He ordered his cooks and butlers to give me victuals and drink, which they pushed forward in vehicles upon wheels till I could reach them. I took these vehicles, and soon emptied them all. 20 of them were filled with meat, and 10 with liquor. Each of the former afforded me 2 or 3 good mouthfuls, and I emptied the liquor of 10 vessels, which was contained in earthen vials, into one vehicle, drinking it off at a draught, and so I did with the rest. The empress and young princes of the blood of both sexes, attended by many ladies, sat at some distance in their chairs. But upon the accident that happened to the emperor's horse, they alighted and came near his person, which I am now going to describe. He is taller than any of his court. His features are strong and masculine, with his Austrian lip and arched, his complexion olive, his body and limbs well proportioned, the motions graceful, and his deportment majestic. He was then past his prime, being 28 years and 3/4 old, of which he reigned about 7 in great felicity, and generally victorious. His dress was very plain and simple, and the fashion of it between the Asiatic and the European. But he had on his head a light helmet of gold, adorned with jewels, and a plume on the crest. He held his sword drawn in his hand to defend himself if I should happen to break loose. His voice was shrill, but very clear and articulate. The ladies and courtiers were all most magnificently clad, so that the spot they stood upon seemed to resemble a petticoat spread on the ground, embroidered with figures of gold and silver. His Imperial Majesty spoke often to me, and I returned answers, but neither of us could understand a syllable. There were several of his priests and lawyers present, as I conjectured by their habits, who were commanded to address themselves to me, and I spoke to them in as many languages as I had the least smattering of, which were High and Low Dutch, Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, and lingua franca, but all to no purpose. After about 2 hours the court retired, and I was left with a strong guard to prevent the impertinence of the rabble, who were very impatient to crowd about me as near as they durst, and some of them had the impudence to shoot their arrows at me as I sat on the ground by the door of my house, whereof one very narrowly missed my left eye. But the colonel ordered 6 of the ringleaders to be seized, and thought no punishment so proper as to deliver them bound into my hands, which some of his soldiers accordingly did, pushing them forwards with the butt ends of their pikes into my reach. I took them all in my right hand, put 5 of them in my coat pocket, and as to the 6th, I made a countenance as if I would eat him alive. The poor man squalled terribly, and the colonel and his officers were in much pain, especially when they saw me take out my penknife. But I soon put them out of fear, for, looking mildly and immediately cutting the strings he was bound with, I set him gently on the ground, and away he ran. I treated the rest in the same manner, taking them one by one out of my pocket, and I observed both the soldiers and people were highly delighted at this mark of my clemency, which was represented very much to my advantage at court. Towards night I got with some difficulty into my house, where I lay on the ground and continued to do so about a fortnight, during which time the emperor gave orders to have a bed prepared for me. 600 beds of the common measure were brought in carriages, and worked up in my house. 150 of their beds, sewn together, made up the breadth and length, and these were 4 double, which, however, kept me but very indifferently from the hardness of the floor that was of smooth stone. By the same computation, they provided me with sheets, blankets, and coverlets, tolerable enough for one who has been so long inured to hardships. As the news of my arrival spread throughout the kingdom, it brought prodigious numbers of rich, idle, and curious people to see me, so that the villages were almost emptied, and the great neglect of tillage and household affairs must have ensured, if His Imperial Majesty had not provided by several proclamations and orders of state against this inconveniency. He directed that those who had already beheld me should return home, and not presume to come within 50 yards of my house without license from the court, whereby the secretaries of state got considerable fees. In the meantime, the emperor had frequent councils to debate what course should be taken with me. They apprehended my breaking loose, that my diet would be very expensive and might cause a famine. Sometimes they determined to starve me, or at least to shoot me in the face and hands with poisoned arrows. In the midst of these consultations, several officers of the army went to the door of the great council chamber, and 2 of them, being admitted, gave an account of my behavior to the 6 criminals, which made so favorable an impression in the breast of His Majesty and the whole board in my behalf, that an imperial commission was issued out, obliging all the villages to deliver every morning 6 beeves, 50 sheep, and other victuals for my sustenance, together with a proportionate quantity of bread and wine and other liquors. An establishment was also made of 600 persons to be my domestics, who had board wages, allowed for their maintenance, and tents built for them on each side of my door. It was likewise ordered that 300 tailors should make me a suit of clothes after the fashion of the country, that 6 of His Majesty's greatest scholars should be employed to instruct me in their language, and that the emperor's horses and those of the nobility and troops of guards should be exercised in my sight to accustom themselves to me. All the orders were duly put in execution, and in about 3 weeks I made a great progress in learning their language, during which time the emperor frequently honored me with his visits, and was pleased to assist my masters in teaching me. We began already to converse together in some sort, and the first words I learnt were to express my desire that he would be pleased to give me my liberty, which I every day repeated on my knees. His answer, as I could apprehend it, was that this must be a work of time, not to be thought of without the advice of his council, and that I must swear a peace with him and his kingdom. He desired I would not take it ill if he gave orders to certain officers to search me, for probably I might carry about me several weapons, which must needs be dangerous things if they answered the bulk of so prodigious a person. I took up the officers in my hands, put them into my coat pockets, and then into every other pocket about me except a secret pocket, which I had no mind should be searched, wherein I had some little necessaries that were of no consequence to any but myself. These gentlemen, having pen, ink, and paper about them, made an exact inventory of everything they saw, and when they had done, desired I would set them down, that they might deliver it to the emperor. When this inventory was read over to the emperor, he directed me, in very gentle terms, to deliver up several particulars. He first called for my scimitar, which I took out, scabbard and all. In the meantime, he ordered 3,000 of his troops, who then attended him, to surround me at a distance with their bows and arrows, just ready to discharge, but I did not observe it, for mine eyes were fixed upon His Majesty. He then desired me to draw my scimitar, which was exceeding bright. I did so, and immediately all the troops gave a shout between terror and surprise, for the sun shone clear, and the reflection dazzled their eyes as I waved the scimitar to and fro in my hand. His Majesty was less daunted than I could expect. He ordered me to return it to the scabbard and cast it on the ground as gently as I could, about 6 feet from the end of my chain. The next thing he demanded was one of the hollow iron pillars, by which he meant my pocket pistols. I drew it out, and at his desire expressed to him the use of it, and charging it only with powder, which happened to escape wetting in the sea, an inconvenience against which all prudent mariners take special care to provide, I first cautioned the emperor not to be afraid, and then I let it off in the air. The astonishment here was much greater than at the sight of the scimitar. Hundreds fell down as if they had been struck dead, and even the emperor, although he stood his ground, could not recover himself for some time. I delivered up both my pistols in the same manner as I had done with my scimitar, and then my pouch of powder and bullets, begging him that the former might be kept from fire, for it would kindle with the smallest spark and blow up his imperial palace into the air. I likewise delivered up my watch, which the emperor was very curious to see. He was amazed at the continual noise it made, and the motion of the minute hand, which he could easily discern, for their sight is much more acute than ours. I had, as I before observed, one private pocket which escaped their search, wherein there was a pair of spectacles, a pocket perspective, and some other little conveniences, which, being of no consequence to the emperor, I did not think myself bound in honor to discover. My gentleness and good behavior had gained so far on the emperor and his court, and indeed upon the army and people in general, that I began to conceive hopes of getting my liberty in a short time. I took all possible methods to cultivate this favorable disposition. The natives came by degrees to be less apprehensive of danger from me. I would sometimes lie down and let 5 or 6 of them dance on my hand, and at last the boys and girls would venture to come and play hide-and-seek in my hair. The horses of the army, and those of the royal stables, having been daily led before me, were no longer shy, but would come up to my feet without starting. The riders would leap them over my hand as I held it on the ground, and one of the emperor's huntsmen, upon a larger courser, took my foot, shoe and all, which was indeed a prodigious leap. I had the good fortune to divert the emperor one day after a very extraordinary manner. I desired he would order several sticks of 2 feet high, and the thickness of an ordinary cane, to be brought me, whereupon his majesty commanded the master of his woods to give directions accordingly, and the next morning 6 woodmen arrived, and with as many carriages drawn by 8 horses each. I took 9 of these sticks, and fixing them firmly in the ground in a quadrangular figure, 2 feet and a half square, I took 4 other sticks and tied them parallel at each corner, about 2 feet from the ground. Then I fastened my handkerchief to the 9 sticks that stood erect, and extended it on all sides till it was tight as the top of a drum, and the 4 parallel sticks, rising about 5 inches higher than the handkerchief, served as ledges on each side. When I had finished my work, I desired the emperor to let a troop of the best horse, 24 in number, come and exercise upon this plain. His majesty approved of the proposal, and I took them up one by one in my hands, ready mounted and armed, with the proper officers to exercise them. As soon as they got into order, they divided into 2 parties, performed mock skirmishes, discharged blunt arrows, drew their swords, fled and pursued, attacked and retired, and, in short, discovered the best military discipline I ever beheld. The parallel sticks secured them and their horses from falling over the stage, and the emperor was so much delighted that he ordered this entertainment to be repeated several days, and once was pleased to be lifted up and give the word of command, and, with great difficulty, persuaded even the empress herself to let me hold her in close chair within 2 yards of the stage, when she was able to take a full view of the whole performance. It was my good fortune that no ill accident happened in these entertainments. Only once a fiery horse that belonged to one of the captains, pawing with his hoof, struck a hole in my handkerchief, and his foot slipping, he overthrew his rider and himself. But I immediately relieved them both, and covering the hole with one hand, I set down the troop with the other in the same manner as I took them up. The horse that fell was strained in the left shoulder, but the rider got no hurt, and I repaired the handkerchief as well I could. However, I would not trust to the strength of it any more in such dangerous enterprises.
End of side 1.